Welcome to The Free Will Show, a podcast that provides a beginner-friendly introduction to free will while also exploring cutting-edge developments on the topic. I'm Taylor Sear.
And I'm Matt Flummer. In this episode, we talk with Chandra Sripada about the distortion model of addiction and how it's different from the standard desire-based model.
Thanks for listening. I'm happy to introduce Chandra Sripada, a Theophile Raphael professor in psychiatry and philosophy at the University of Michigan. Chandra works on issues in ethics and moral psychology, focusing on agency and self-control. His work integrates philosophical theorizing with results drawn from empirical disciplines, especially psychology, neuroscience, and psychiatry. He's the author or co-author of many articles and book chapters in philosophy, as well as in the empirical scientific disciplines I just mentioned. And several of those publications have to do with addiction, which is the topic of today's episode. And Chandra has graciously given his time to come and talk to us about that today. So welcome to the show, Chandra. Can you start by telling us a bit about yourself, your work, and how you came to be interested in working on issues related to free will?
Yeah, thank you very much, Taylor and Matt, for inviting me on. It's wonderful to be here. I'm always excited to talk about free will-related topics. You've already told folks about me and my background, so I don't need to talk much more about that. My background is I grew up in Texas, went to University of Texas at Austin. I went to I'm an MD, PhD, and I did my graduate work at Rutgers University. And I've been on the faculty of University of Michigan for, more than a dozen years now. You asked how I got interested in free will, which is, that's a great question because I had to do some mental dredge work to try to figure that out. And I think I got to the moment, which was my sophomore year in college at University of Texas. I had broken my arm playing basketball, so I couldn't do the essay exam, and they assigned a alternative format. So I chose the topic of free will because there was something rumbling inside of me that there was something fishy about this idea. And I had, eventually, now I know I was feeling, Strawson's basic argument, the impossibility of moral responsibility is the name of the article. That was the kind of thing that got me into this. I could never articulate it as well as Galen Strawson could. But that was my entry point. And many decades later, I'm still struggling with that exact problem.
Well, that's fascinating.
So it's all broke my arm,
Yeah. That's interesting, yeah. In your recent work, you've argued that addiction should be understood in terms of cognitive and evaluative distortions. So we're going to ask more about that model in a minute, but could you first tell us a bit about the standard model of addiction in terms of irresistible and compulsive desires?
Yeah, great. That's an excellent starting point because that may be the ordinary understanding of addiction, understands addiction that way. The philosophical understanding is similar, and probably many scientists have this view as well. And, I pulled out a couple of quotes. One is William James, who famously wrote, and this is often repeated in these discussions of addiction, quote, "Were a keg of rum in one corner of a room and were a cannon constantly discharging balls between me and it, I could not refrain from passing before that cannon in order to get the rum." So that's James not speaking about his own personal perspective, but citing what he thinks individuals with addiction tend to say. And that, that gets to the heart of the matter. There's a picture of addiction that involves something that compels the individual beyond anything that they can control. Another vivid depiction of this is Harry Frankfurt. And Freedom of Will and the Concept of a Person, he presents the figure of the unwilling addict. And he says, "This man hates his addiction and always struggles desperately, although to no avail, against its thrust. He tries everything that he thinks might enable him to overcome his desire for the drug, but these desires are too powerful for him to withstand, and invariably, in the end, they conquer him. Another beautiful depiction of this kind of idea.
Mm-hmm.
So if I were to distill that down, the common thread that runs through these kinds of pictures is there's a part of you, the appetitive part, that wants to use the drug. There's a part of you, something about like the reasoning or rational part, give it many different kinds of glosses, that hates the drug. And there's a contest between the two that can be understood hydraulically.
Mm-hmm.
The appetitive part pushes you to use, the reasoning part pushes back, and the problem is that the reasoning part is overpowered. That's a pretty good depiction of what many people think happens in addiction.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So you raise several problems with this standard model in your work, including that the data doesn't really support it. Could you lay out some of the objections to the standard model here?
Yeah. Good. So I should have added, I did say that the standard model is what the ordinary person may believe.
Yeah.
Philosophers have this view. I wanted to make that clear.
Yeah.
Even, one of you, I think, studied with John Martin Fisher
Mm-hmm.
in Responsibility and Control. He talks about a drug called Please You. And it is this kind of irresistible flavor. And scientists have this view as well. So what are the problems with this kind of view? One striking one is that there are a very large number of studies that ask individuals with addictions, and I'm going to be focusing overwhelmingly on drug-directed addictions.
Mm-hmm.
They ask individuals on a Likert scale, so these are these 1 to 7 scales.
Mm-hmm.
How strong are your desires or your cravings to use drugs? It's remarkable that on these kinds of surveys, self-report survey items, you rarely find people reporting levels that are stronger than the midpoint.
Really?
And often it's considerably below the midpoint. So that's a data point.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually we'll talk about the citations and things like that. And I'll recommend a paper that a lot of these arguments are drawn from.
Mm-hmm.
But from now, I'm just going to assert things without giving you the citation. There's another data point that I think is striking, and this goes back to work by Marlott and colleagues from 1968. These are individuals with addictions, and they've relapsed, and then they do a kind of track back, retrospective recall of what was going on when you relapsed. And people don't identify, and these are very powerful types of studies. Unfortunately, they're hard to do, but people don't identify strong desires or temptation as the cause. So they say strong emotions and stress. So they were upset. That's a very common thing that they list. Interpersonal conflicts is another really, really important thing that they identify. You're getting a picture not of a person that, as Frankfurt described, has an overwhelmingly desire to use. Mm-hmm. You get you picture of a person in distress, often distressed about their circumstances, and especially interpersonal circumstances. And that's why they're using. And that's what brought them to relapse. There's other arguments, but I'll mention one more. So the first two, I think, I've kind of mentioned in my work a little bit more. There's another one I've mentioned in my work that just overlaps with many philosophers noting this. The great Doug Husak at Rutgers, my former teacher, and Hannah Pickard and others have identified the phenomenon that individuals with addictions, they have a lot of choice in the matter. So they can quit cold turkey. They can go on an airline for 10 hours and not use. A common observation is when a policeman is at the elbow, and so consequences for using are very salient, they can withhold using. And that's too much incentive sensitivity, too much choice to be compatible at least so the claim goes, with the standard model that is invoking overwhelming desires.
Right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And very different, like, than having the cannonball example too. So
That's right. And, I didn't read quotes from scientists, but, Alan Leshner, former head of the NIAAA, Nora Volkow, current head of of NIDA, they've talked about use that hijacks the mind and compels the individual to use drugs. So that doesn't, these observations that I just made don't seem compatible with the standard model.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's turn to your alternative model now. In terms of cognitive and evaluative distortions, is how you put it. So, could you say a bit about your picture of the mind and how these distortions operate?
Right. Good. Yeah. So the view that I'm offering about addiction is nested within a view about how the mind operates. And so I'm going to talk generically about my own kind of picture of how the mind operates, and then eventually circle back to addiction. And this view about how the mind operates is grounded in, it's not unfamiliar in philosophy, though in contemporary philosophy, it's a little less emphasized. But if you go back to like Buddhist philosophy of mind or Stoic philosophy of mind, you get a very granular picture in which mind is operating very rapidly and is ubiquitously, rapidly forming cognitive and evaluative impressions. So this is a much more granular picture of mind than, people familiar with Davidson, the person has a desire for a beer and believes that the best way to get a beer is to go to the local pub, and that gets together and causes action. Well, that's a very kind of high-level picture of mind. It's not inaccurate, but we're moving to a much more granular picture of mind. And that approach is actually familiar in approaches in psychotherapy, especially one's cognitive behavioral psychotherapy associated with Aaron Beck, and in cognitive science and in AI. They have this more granular picture in mind. Okay, so we've got the granular picture. The mind is ubiquitously forming moment-to-moment impressions of, an event happens, what happened? Why did it happen that way? What do others think about it? Those are kind of cognitive impressions. Mind is also forming evaluative impressions. Is it good or bad? In particular, what is the expected value of the thing that happened with respect to my more basic goals and commitments? Now, to be clear, these are not propositional, introspectively accessible. You're not forming, you're not asking yourself, hey, that event, what is its relation to my goals and commitments? Instead, the mind is automatically forming impressions of that thing's relation to your own goals and commitments. You experience it, subjectively as affect and other kind of phenomena like that. Okay, now we have the mind ubiquitously forming cognitive evaluative impressions. Add another layer. These impressions are susceptible to distortions. So in clinical setting, so psychiatry is a field that I draw from. It's one of my own backgrounds. The idea of a distortion is very well rooted. Clinicians are familiar with this. These are psychological factors that produce systematic and pervasive patterns of misimpressions. So this machinery of mind that's ubiquitously forming cognitive and evaluative impressions, it can be biased. The most extensively studied example is negativity bias, which you find in dysthymic and depressive clinical presentations. So that's an individual that's forming impressions about their self, the environment, and their future that's pessimistically biased. Okay. I mean, I can pause there. I wonder if this kind of picture is familiar. I mean, May not be something that you explicitly, but it's probably something that you've may have some familiarity to you.
Yeah. Is there an analogy between maybe like visual perception and making mistakes in visual perception, like with mirages or hallucinations or things like that?
Yeah, that's a terrific. The picture of mind that I'm offering is one. These impressions are quasi-perceptual. They're intuitive rather than rooted in intermediate steps involving reasoning.
Mm-hmm.
And just as the way you say, because they're quasi-perceptual, the same way that visual perception can be distorted under certain circumstances, these impressions can be distorted and have their own characteristic profile in which they're distorted. So negativity bias would be one way in which these quasi-perceptual the quasi-perceptual impressions can be systematically distorted. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah, that makes sense.
There's one more layer to it. So when you have a mind and you're looking at the mind from this granular perspective and you're thinking about it as a computational problem, you have this machine that's ubiquitously forming cognitive evaluative impressions, and it can, in some cases, form misimpressions. Well, what is the capacity of that system to recognize, scrutinize, and correct misimpressions? That capacity is necessarily going to be limited.
Mm-hmm.
It was just from computational principles and bounded rationality. If that capacity were perfect, then we wouldn't even be calling this machinery for automatic formation of impressions. We would be able to ubiquitously scrutinize and correct. It wouldn't be automatic anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
The reason so much of it operates automatically is abilities to recognize, scrutinize, and correct is generally limited and unreliable.
Mm-hmm.
You can think of it as a blizzard, a deluge of these impressions going on. It's going to be very hard for the person to recognize when they're systematically going by.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really helpful description of the picture of mind in the background. Maybe now we could turn to an example of a case of addiction, perhaps drug addiction. In that kind of case, how does the model apply, and how is it different from the standard model of addiction?
Yeah, good. So we've got a picture of mind. It's a granular picture. It's ubiquitously forming cognitive and evaluative impressions. On the basis of those, it's making various choices. The ability to scrutinize and correct is limited. Now add an individual. So now we populate what is the characteristic kind of distortions that might be operating in individuals with addiction. And clinically, we know this. We know this from extensive studies of very extensive comorbidity between addiction and depression and anxiety. Some of the distortions that are operative are the pessimistic and inappropriately threat-oriented distortions of self, environment, and future that you find in depression and anxiety. So this is a person who's self-critical, views their circumstances through a negative light, and thinks that the future looks bleak. The person has distortions about, this is something that I mentioned Marlott earlier, who's also the founder of cognitive behavioral interventions for addiction. False beliefs about abilities to cope without drugs. These individuals often have beliefs that if I cannot use, I'm not going to be able to hold it together. Now, you test some of these beliefs against reality, the person can hold it better than they think.
Mm-hmm.
But the fact is they harbor many misimpressions about this. They have exaggerated impressions of the positive or euphoric effects of drugs. This has something to do with the physiology of how drugs operate. They exaggerate the amount of reward or positive effects that one expects, but it is inaccurate, these expectations. And there are a host of minimizations of negative repercussions of use. Some of these are kind of rationalizations, or what often found is denial. And so Hannah Pickard has an excellent paper about this kind of phenomenon. And I mentioned difficulties of these individuals to recognize and scrutinize the first order misimpressions that they have. So a characteristic trajectory would be the person has a pessimistic view of what their future looks like. And they say, well, they ask themselves in a moment of scrutiny, is it the case that things are as bleak as they seem? And what comes to mind is another impression. Well, I'm going to fuck this up. I'm a fuck up. Yeah. I don't know if I can say that in a podcast, but that's a pretty good depiction. What comes to mind is itself a misimpression. So now you're scrutinizing first order misimpressions with further layers of misimpressions. So this is a tangled, interlocked set of misimpressions that arise over time, and they constitute over time a kind of illusion, a cognitive and evaluative illusion that portrays the benefits of using drugs as higher than the costs of using drugs. So from there, what is needed to use drugs is benefits breaches the thresholds of cost, and ordinary choice is all that's needed to get the person to use drugs. Now, often there is a situational stressor that introduces additional layers of distortion. So interpersonal conflict.
Yeah.
That's a potent way to get the threshold to be breached, where it seems to you that the thing to do now is to use.
Mm-hmm.
So overall, the picture there is one in which the individual misrepresents aspects of their self, their environment, their future, cognitively and evaluatively. Typically, that involves populations of misimpressions that arise over time and form interlocking patterns. And what's needed to get the person to use is choice, ordinary choice.
Mm-hmm.
How does that contrast with the standard model? Well, we've actually gone a very long way from the standard model.
Yeah, totally.
The standard model, remember, was William James and the person who is walking in front of cannonballs in order to get the rum. Or the unwilling addict who hates his addiction and struggles desperately but is conquered. Yeah. So the very language that we're using to characterize the two phenomenon in the standard model, it's a hydraulic language of pressure, force, overpowered, conquered. But in the distortion model, the language is all epistemically rooted. It's misled, distorted, inaccurate, and mirage in terms of that, illusory. And so forth.
Yeah. So you say your model offers a different perspective on moral responsibility for individuals with addictions. Can you say more about how the distortion model understands moral responsibility for someone with an addiction and how this perspective differs from the standard model?
Good. So, I mean, you've done many interviews on free will and moral responsibility, but I'll go back to, some basic distinctions that philosophers often use in this area.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, I think one of you worked with John Martin Fisher. So in responsibility and control, they distinguish the control and the epistemic conditions from moral responsibility. Their entire book is basically about the control condition. They don't tackle the epistemic condition. The epistemic condition has recently become of much more interest to philosophers. I won't define, and it is tough to mark the distinction, but I'll give an example that I think intuitively conveys what the two conditions are, and now link those back up to the standard view and the distortion model of addiction. So imagine that you're driving a car and you need to get to the hospital, and your passenger is very, very ill, and you got to get to the hospital. And there's two ways that you might fail in getting the passenger, as you're morally obligated to do, to get them to the hospital. One way is the car you're in, for some reason, it's got a wheel lock on it. You try as hard as you can to turn that wheel, and it's not going to turn. And you're struggling against it, and it's just locked.
Mm-hmm.
That intuitively implicates the control condition. Something about a freedom-relevant thing that you, or capacity that you ought to have, it has gone missing. Okay. And another way that you might fail in getting the person to the hospital is, it turns out that you're in a new town for whatever reason, and you don't know which way to go. You're at an intersection. I don't know which way the hospital is, so you can't get the person to the hospital. The standard model, William James, Harry Frankfurt, John Martin Fisher when he's talking about please you, many other philosophers, when they're talking about addiction, think that something like the control condition is implicated. Mm-hmm. There's something in your psychology that's blocking or preventing or constraining you. But in the picture that I've offered, remember the building blocks of that view are the mind is ubiquitously involved in forming impressions, cognitive impressions, evaluative impressions. This machinery is susceptible to distortions, and the individual has a large set of misimpressions about their self, their future, their environment. The misimpressions lead to a kind of an illusory exaggeration of the benefits relative to the costs, and they choose. Yeah. Okay, that representational repertoire that I'm describing, if that's inaccurate, and that's the basis in which the person makes their choice, that implicates much more closely the epistemic condition for moral responsibility. The basis for excuse, if there is one, is going to run through the epistemic condition. Now, a person might say, well, didn't you just say earlier that the person has a tough time scrutinizing and revising and correcting their first order misimpressions? Isn't that a kind of control that's absent? And I would say, yeah, there's a kind of blurring of the epistemic and control condition in the distortion model. And yet, I would still say, if a person has trouble correcting or revising a misimpression, it's often because of further kinds of epistemic lack of recognition of how to that something needs to be corrected. Or the example I gave, a person thinks that they're a fuck up, which is itself a misimpression. We're just in a kind of epistemic circle where you're stuck, and you can't revise misimpressions because of further misimpressions. Ultimately, I think the dominant theme in the distortion model is the epistemic condition for moral responsibility. Misrepresentation and further layers of misrepresentation. Mm-hmm. You can use the term control in a kind of expansive sense, but what's doing the work is various kinds of epistemic limitations that you have.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That's helpful for seeing the difference between your model and the standard model too.
Yeah.
Now, one thing you say is that it's possible for a person to use drugs rationally, even substantial quantities of drugs. And you think that distortion model can clarify what differentiates rational drug use from drug addiction. Could you say a bit more about how to draw the boundary there?
Yeah, good. So, I mean, I'm a psychiatrist, among other things. And that means that in psychiatry, in seeing patients, you diagnose addiction using the DSM. Mm-hmm. And the DSM encourages you to look at the presence of certain kinds of symptom clusters. And so the DSM encourages you to say, do they have physiological tolerance? They're using more to get the same effect. Do they have evidence of physiological withdrawal? For example, the heart beats faster when they haven't used drugs in a while, like alcohol. Other symptom clusters involve Are there adverse consequences from their use? Another symptom cluster is, are they preoccupied? You can think that the DSM has latched on to some indicators of what is problematic about addiction. But I would argue that when we have our philosopher's hat on and we're asking questions about the metaphysics of addiction, what makes it the case that a certain phenomenon counts as addiction? I view misrepresentation and misimpressions as what is absolutely central to the phenomenon. So the picture that I gave earlier is the person has distortions. The person with addiction typically has distortions associated with depression and anxiety. Mm-hmm. They misrepresent aspects of their self, their environment, their future. They exaggerate the benefits of drugs, misrepresent in a downward way the consequences of using drugs, misrepresent their ability to cope. When they make the choice to use drugs, the evaluative and cognitive representational structures that they're utilizing, the map, is highly inaccurate. That, to me, metaphysically, draws the boundary between something that is pathological versus something that's not. Mm-hmm. Okay, then what would be a case of using drugs that's not pathological, by my view, but would be under the DSM? So that would be somebody who veridically represents their circumstances and chooses to use drugs, even very large quantities. So take a person who lives in difficult and precarious circumstances, limited economic resources, work is monotonous and unsatisfying, no social supports, the prospects of the future legitimately are bleak. You can go on and on with what, and they veridically represent all this. And using drugs, even large quantities, provides some measure of relief and is their only access to it. Well, this person can use a lot of drugs. They can have some negative consequences at work from using the drugs. That's a DSM criterion. They can have some preoccupation with it. That's a DSM criterion. They can have physiological tolerance and withdrawal. But if there is no misrepresentation, if there's no illusory representation of the benefits being greater than the cost, it's veridical that the benefits are greater than the costs. It's not pathological. It's not addiction. So, addiction is a term that carries with it normative significance, and it needs to be anchored in something that can be the right kind of grounds for that normativity. And we want these determinations not to have an external bullying aspect where you impose a normative grid on somebody. The view that addiction fundamentally involves a kind of inaccurate representation, that to me is the right kind of thing to ground the normativity of a claim that somebody is experiencing a pathological state. It's saying that the person's map by which they steer is corrupted, which is a minimal and justifiable type of invocation of normativity.
Yeah. Before we ask about the broader lessons, I had a couple questions about the model. We focused most of the discussion on drug addiction, but is this going to be translatable to other types of addiction?
Yeah, I mean, people talk about addiction to things like gambling, addiction to internet, addiction to gaming, addiction to food. To me, what is going to have to be shown if these other things, so I'll argue for the following conditional claim. If it can be shown that the kinds of cases that people want to say are examples of gambling addiction or internet addiction, what needs to be vindicated for those claims to be true, on my view, is the individual engaging in those behaviors is experiencing systematic and pervasive distortions that lead to misimpressions, that exaggerate the benefits of these activities versus the cost. And when they choose to engage in these activities, there's a kind of problem in which they are choosing based on misrepresenting evaluative and cognitive map. If those things can be shown for these other areas, yeah, these other things should be called addictions as well.
Yeah. Okay. One of the pieces of evidence that you provided was the surveys of people saying, well, the desire that I had for the drug was only like a 4 or whatever.
Yeah.
Is it possible that some of these people are just self-deceived about how strong their own desires are?
Yeah. I mean, it could be. And one shouldn't. So I want to make clear that it's not one survey that's shown this.
Mm-hmm.
So, craving intensity is an extensively studied phenomenon. And this is a regular thing that you see across different drug categories and different patient populations and so forth. So it's one data point, but it's a pretty well-supported data point.
Yeah.
I think the key is to take that data point along with the other kinds of data points. So, for example, in retrospective assessment of why did individuals relapse, they're not citing the strength of temptation.
Yeah.
They're citing interpersonal problems and conflicts and stressors or strong emotions. And when you add in data points around the phenomenon that I called incentive sensitivity, the ability for people to start and stop when the incentives are made salient, the overall picture is probably not people are simply misdescribing the strength of their desire. It's probably that strength of desire, and especially overwhelming strength, is not the root of the issue. It's more, as the distortion model postulates, it's misrepresentations that are at the root. That explains why they're not citing very strong desires at the moment that they choose.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If I could jump in with one question here too, we talked a little bit about how the different models might diverge on particular cases, giving one diagnosis versus another. I'm curious if you see any big differences in like proposed treatments or responses to cases of addiction between the two models, even when there is agreement about this being a particular case of addiction.
Yeah. In a way, the divergence in treatment is already baked into clinical practice. What I mean by that is therapeutic interventions for addiction often prioritize and render central concurrently dealing with distortions that are associated with depression and anxiety. That's simply the standard of care universally used by experienced counselors and therapists and so forth. Somebody comes in with addiction, you're not thinking that this is a person with no other problems and just has an exaggerated desire for drugs. You're recognizing that this addiction rests against a background of an individual with a large set of characteristic distortions that are going to need to be discussed as part of the treatment. So it is interesting because I said scientists and clinicians often invoke the language of lack of control, and they use the language of the standard model.
Right.
And yet their therapeutic interventions are not necessarily consistent with that.
Mm-hmm.
The way they actually approach addiction, I believe, is far closer to what the distortion model would have supported.
Right.
So you do have a kind of a disconnect. There's almost a kind of common way we talk about these things. But then there is the model that rationalizes what we actually do in clinical care.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. What accounts for so many really intelligent people continuing to use a model that the data just doesn't support?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the most, there's multiple reasons, and if we want to do another hour, we can go through all that. But there's one reason that really stands out. People recognize that addiction presents responsibility mitigating factors.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody who has worked with this population and has worked in psychiatry more broadly comes very quickly to the recognition that something mitigating responsibility is operative here. And it's hard to put your finger on what exactly is going on. And so the first thing that people reach for is a familiar model of how responsibility mitigation works. They say, oh, what's going on is the person couldn't help it. They lacked control.
Yeah.
And what is more challenging, though, what takes a little bit more time to realize, is that there is a epistemic pathway to understand what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
That does require some kind of recognition of a model of mind that is not obvious. That is the more granular view of mind, which involves ubiquitous formation of quasi-perceptual impressions, and the way that distortions can operate there, and the computationally intractable problem of supervising and correcting those ongoing formation impressions being formed. Because that model is not easily accessible, people reach for the one that is more familiar, and they end up with this kind of standard model that emphasizes hydraulic force constraining the individual.
Yeah. Well, let's turn now to broader lessons and connections that we can draw from your account of addiction in other areas of moral psychology. So are there any of these that you would like to discuss before we close?
Yeah, I mean, so the picture of addiction that I'm offering is one offshoot, or one way to put it is an implication that arises from taking seriously a picture of mind. And I said earlier that it's not philosophical heresy at all, or it's not even novel in philosophy. Buddhist conceptions of mind, Stoic conceptions of mind, classical conceptions of mind often have the flavor of a mind ubiquitously forming cognitive and evaluative impressions. Like I said, that view is taken on board in psychotherapeutic schools like CBT. That kind of view is very familiar in cognitive science. That kind of view undergirds the current AI revolution. So those AIs are a kind, maybe that's a separate discussion, but people working in AI are very familiar with the mind cycling through a decision theoretic loop, forming impressions about what is the case and what needs to be done in a very rapid way. So what I've been talking about in addiction is an offshoot or application of that picture of mind. And I think that that picture of mind has enormous lessons and ramifications for moral psychology broadly. Mm-hmm. I've tried to set this out in one large paper that recently came out in Philosophical Psychology that's called the Valuationist Model of Human Agent Architecture. And what I'm doing there is really synthesizing the recent cognitive science that takes seriously this kind of view of mind as especially forming evaluative impressions ubiquitously. And that's the basis of all our choices, and these rapid choices are the basis of our agency. And it has ramifications for how you think about the nature of action, a perennial, issue of fascination for philosophers. The boundaries between activity and passivity. How to think about motivation. I think we need to think about motivation far more as a representational phenomenon. The mind forms evaluative impressions that have accuracy conditions, are evaluable in terms of whether they get things correct or not. It has ramifications for how you think about the genesis or the etiology of irrationality. It has implications for moral responsibility. So I lean on the epistemic condition for moral responsibility to do almost all the work for excuse. I think the control condition actually gets crowded out and has very limited applicability in philosophy. It has ramifications for issues like doxastic voluntarism and what kind of control do we have over action versus control over epistemic states like belief. So I think there's a research program that arises from thinking about mind from this kind of evaluationist perspective. And everything I've said about addiction is kind of an offshoot of that. But there are many, many other offshoots with kind of interesting philosophical implications.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Well, thanks again, Chandra, for joining us, for going into depth on your model of addiction. If listeners want to see what else you're working on, read some more of your papers, where can they go to find you online?
I would say for folks, go to my website, and I've got things organized, philosophy papers, psychiatry papers. Increasingly, the two just blur. A lot of what I've said about this valuationist picture, I've got papers, kind of empirical papers, and theoretical papers that talk about this kind of cluster of issues. So my website is a good place to go, and I think you can see a lot of this work. Reach out to me. I'd be happy to have a conversation with folks.
Good.
Yeah, cool. Thanks again.
Okay.
In our next episode, which will be the final episode of Season 10, we'll talk about P.F. Strawson and moral responsibility, and our guest will be Pamela Hieronymi, professor of philosophy at the University of California, Los Angeles.
Okay. For a dissenting perspective, you need to invite me back about P.F. Strawson.
All right.
I praise the younger Strawson daily, but I have some questions or skepticism about the elder Strawson.
Nice.
The moral responsibility.
That's great. Yeah,
I'm just kidding. That sounds fantastic.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.